Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we've got another Power Rankings video. Week 16 of our Power Rankings series, and the second to last one before the Olympic break. There has been some changes. We'll see if there's a change at the number one position. I'll touch on the Power Rankings coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. Now before we get started, don't forget to like this video and subscribe down below. Thank you for all of your support. I would never be able to with all of you guys, so if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe button down below. Don't forget to leave a comment. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers. And don't forget to stay tuned for videos coming out in the very near future. I do apologize for any background noise, and I am still getting over a cold, so if I do sound a little bit stuffy to you, I do apologize. But in today's video, we've got a new Power Rankings video. As per usual, we'll start off by looking at the 3 honorable mentions and then make our way into the top 10 of the Power Rankings, and there has been some very interesting shiftment. So we'll start with the 3 honorable mentions. At the 3rd honorable mention spot here today is a team who didn't have a fantastic week, but had a pretty dang good week, going 2-0 last week, and have got themselves within striking distance of a playoff spot entering Monday's game action, and have not lost a whole bunch of games since hiring Rick Bowness as head coach, and that is the Columbus Blue Jackets. The Jackets had a pretty solid week this week. Started out the week with a bad loss to the Ottawa Senators 4-1, but recovered well, taking down the Dallas Stars in a shutout fashion 1-0, and then beat the Tampa Bay Lightning 8-5 in a shootout thriller. So very interesting note there, but the Jackets won 2 of their 3 games this week, and those 2 games were against 2 of the best teams in the entire NHL, so very interesting note there. They are within striking distance of a playoff spot, 4 points back of the Islanders entering Monday's game action, so we shall see if the Jackets are able to keep pace, but still very interesting note there. The Jackets had a really solid week. They were a really good team. They got themselves back into the playoff race, and they're, I think, 5 out of 6 wins with Rick Bowness as head coach, so they've been doing pretty good. So I'm going to put them as a 3rd honorable mention. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with guys like Marchenko, Marchment, who's fitting really well. Defensively, not looking too shabby with Zach Werenski, who's Norris favorite again, and in net, Jet Greaves has been doing pretty good in net. So all in all, really solid stuff there from the Jackets, as they are the 3rd honorable mention. The 2nd honorable mention is actually a team who was in the Power Rankings last week, I think at the 8th spot, and that is the Vegas Golden Knights. They had a terrible week last week. They went 1-3-0. They started out the week with a bad loss to Philadelphia that ended their 7-game winning streak. Then they followed out by going down 4-0 to Boston. Almost came back, but did lose 4-3 to the Boston Bruins. Then they wound up winning the Marner return game, taking down the Toronto Maple Leafs back over on Friday 6-3, which was an impressive win, but then followed that up with a big goose egg, losing 7-1 to the Ottawa Senators. They just did not play well in that game. So because of the loss to Ottawa, Boston, Philadelphia, I'm going to bump them out for the time being out of the Power Rankings and into the honorable mention category. They have a good week this week. They could find themselves back into the Power Rankings next week, but still, going 1-3-0, only winning 1 game, that's not really good news there for the Golden Knights. They still lead the Pacific Division, so I'm not going to bump them out of the Power Rankings completely, but they are now in the honorable mention category, so interesting note there. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with Stone, with Eichel, whose point streak just came to an end. Defensively, Theodore, Anderson, both looking pretty good, and in net, Hill, it's been all right, but he hasn't been fantastic, so very interesting note there. But the Knights have been bumped down to the honorable mention category, and the first honorable mention is a team who's been on an absolute heater and got themselves back into a top 3 spot in the Metro Division, and that is the Pittsburgh Penguins. The Penguins this week had a 4-game road trip. They had to go through Western Canada and Seattle, and they won all 4 of their games. They took down the Kraken 6-3, the Flames 4-1, destroyed the Oilers 6-2, and took down the Vancouver Canucks 3-2. 4 very impressive wins for the Pittsburgh Penguins. That's gone them into 2nd spot in the Metro Division. They are on a fantastic hit right now. They've won 5 of 6 games. They're on a 7-game point streak. Like, the Penguins are looking great, and they're looking like a team that could easily make the playoffs at this point, which I think would have been surprising if you mentioned me this in the preseason. So Penguins are looking really good. They swept Western Canada and Seattle, and that is why they're going up to 1st spots. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with Crosby and Malkin. Defensively, not looking too shabby with a guy like Chris Letang. And in net, Skinner has been fitting in phenomenally with the Pittsburgh Penguins. So all in all, really solid stuff there from the Penguins. They're in a playoff spot, 2nd spot in the Metro Division. They've won won 4 straight. They're on a 7-game point streak, and that is why I'm putting them in the honorable mention. So very interesting note there. And lastly, here going over to the top 10 teams in this week's power rankings. So the 10th spot this week getting bumped down from the 7th spot last week in the power rankings. We have the Montreal Canadiens. They did not have a great week this week. They went 1-2-0. They started the week really great. A late game winner from Cole Caulfield helped them beat the Minnesota Wild 4-3, which was very impressive stuff there from the Habs. But they followed that up with 2 crucial losses to big-time Atlantic rivals, and that is the Buffalo Sabres and the Boston Bruins. The Sabres got to a 3-0 lead, couldn't recover, lost 4-2, and then they actually had a lead against the Boston Bruins, but gave up 2 goals in short succession that made them lose 4-3 to the Boston Bruins. They are now only 1 point up entering Monday's game action of the Boston Bruins for the first wildcard spots, and they're not even in the top 3 anymore. So because of all of that, bumped them down to the 10th spot. They have a 28-17-7 record. They're still in the playoff spot, and they're still doing pretty good, so that's why I'm not bumping them completely out of the power rankings. But after a bad week like this, I'm going to bump them down to the 10th spot in the power rankings. Offensively, team's still looking pretty good with Suzuki, with Caulfield, with Slavkovsky. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Matheson and Hudson. And in net, they haven't been great, but Montembeau's been alright. So very interesting note there. But the Habs fall to 10th spot in the power rankings. 9th spot in the power rankings, and re-entering for the first time in weeks, and after being not ranked last week, the Anaheim Ducks. They had a really solid week last week. They went 4-0-0 and entered Monday's game action with a 7-game winning streak. They started out the week with a win over the New York Rangers, which was impressive and not too surprising. Then they took down the Colorado Avalanche in a shootout 2-1, which was a very impressive win there, and they got a little bit of redemption after Colorado sent them spiraling in late November. Then they beat the Seattle Kraken 4-2 in what was a big game against a rival who was really close to them, and then they came from behind to take down the Calgary Flames 4-3 in overtime in a game in which Beckett Seneca had a hat trick. So very interesting note there, very good stuff there. They're still one of the top teams in the Pacific Division. They're within striking distance of both second spot and first spot in the Pacific Division, and they're looking really good. They're up to a 28-21-3 record and on a 7-game win streak. So because of all of that, I'm putting them up to the 9th spot in the power rankings. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with Seneca, with Granlund, with Kreider. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Trouba and Mitnyakov. And in net, Dossel, especially against the Avalanche, was brilliant. So very interesting note there, but the Ducks go undefeated this week. They're back to 3rd spot in the Pacific, and that is why they are 9th in the power rankings. 8th in the power rankings after a pretty good bounce back week was the Dallas Stars. They had a pretty solid week. They took down the Boston Bruins 6-2 in impressive fashion to end their losing streak to begin the week. Then, like we talked about earlier, got shut out by the Blue Jackets and followed that up with a very impressive victory over the St. Louis Blues. So a couple of big wins against the Bruins and the Blues, lost a narrow game to the Blue Jackets, but still getting 2 out possible 3 points. Not too shabby, and that's why they do bump up 1 spot from last week. Still a pretty good team, still one of the best teams in the Central Division. So because of that, I'm going to bump them up just a little bit, but still some impressive games there last week from the Dallas Stars. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with guys like Duchesne, Johnston, Rantanen. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Heiskanen and Lindell. And in net, Andre's been pretty good. So all in all, really solid stuff there from the Stars. As they go 2-1-0, they're up to a 29-14-9 record, and that is why they go up to 8th spot in the power rankings. 7th spot in the power rankings after being 10th spot last week and continuing on with their point and win streak is the Utah Mammoth. Only had 2 games last week, but they went 2-0 to extend their win streak to 5 games and their point streak to 9. Very impressive stuff there from Utah. They were down 3-0 at one point to the Philadelphia Flyers, but stormed back and took them down 5-4 in overtime, thanks to some late game heroics from Clayton Keller. And then they also were able to take down the Nashville Predators 5-2 in an impressive fashion. So very interesting note there, but the Mammoth got a couple of really good wins. They have a very tough schedule this week, so I wouldn't be surprised if they had a 500-ish record this week as they play both Florida teams and Carolina. But still, very interesting note there. They had a really solid week last week, and entering Monday's game action, they were the first wildcard team, and for a portion of Saturday, if they were in the Pacific Division, would have been 2nd in the Pacific Division. So very good stuff there from the Mammoth, but they go up to the 7th spot in the power rankings. Offensively, team's looking good with Keller, there with Hayton, with Schmalz. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Marino and Sergachev. And in net, Melka was brilliant last week. So very interesting note there. Really good stuff there from the Mammoths as they go up to 7th in the power rankings. Next up is 6th in the power rankings. And at 6th in the power rankings, bumping down 2 spots from last week. Not anything against them, but just because a couple of other teams wound up jumping them in the standings. And that is the Detroit Red Wings. They had a pretty solid week. They actually had a 3-game point streak last week. They went 2-0-1. They had an overtime win over the Toronto Maple Leafs. They had an overtime loss to the Minnesota Wild and finished off the week with a win over the Winnipeg Jets in impressive fashion. They finished off the week still first spot in the Atlantic Division, even though the Bolts do have games in hand, and they are still cruising and looking like a team who's going to make the playoffs. They're at what, 69 points right now? So like they are on pace to probably hit the 100 point mark and probably make the playoffs. So like the Red Wings are looking really good. Getting 5 out of possible 6 points, including playing the Minnesota Wild, is nothing to scoff at. And the Red Wings still in the Atlantic Division are still really impressive. But there were a couple of other teams who had better weeks, which is why I'm moving them down to 6th spot in the power rankings. But still, the Red Wings had a pretty solid week. Offensively, teams looking pretty good with the Brinket, with Raymond, with Kane. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Seider and Sherratt. And in net, Gibson has been brilliant for the Detroit Red Wings. So very interesting note there. But Red Wings are up to a 32-16-5 record. They had a 3-game point streak this week, but they do fall down to 6th spot in the power rankings. At the 5th spot in the power rankings this week, after another really solid week, you have the Buffalo Sabres, who won 3 of 4 games last week. Not a bad record there from the Buffalo Sabres. Started the week with a 2-1 loss to Carolina, a very defensive battle in which Brendan Bussi got the last laugh, but then took down Nashville Predators 5-3, a game in which Hellenius had a 3-point first period. Then they took down the Montreal Canadiens, which we talked about, 4-2, and ended the week with a 5-0 shutout victory over the New York Islanders. So they're in a really good spot. They've now leapfrogged Montreal for the 3rd spot in the Atlantic Division, and while they still are a couple points back, they're not too far out of 1st and 2nd in the Atlantic behind Detroit and Tampa. The Sabres are looking great. They're looking cool. They're looking composed, and they could easily end their playoff drought. This might finally be the year, but this is the first time, I think, all season long, I'm bumping them up. They are a top 5 team right now in the NHL in my eyes. Offensively, teams looking pretty good with guys like Thompson, Doan, Tuck. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Dahlin and Byram, and in net, Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen has been pretty good for the Buffalo Sabres. So all in all, really solid stuff there from Buffalo. But after going 3-0 this week and getting back in the 3rd spot in the Atlantic Division, and bumping them up to top 5 team at the 5th spot in the power rankings. 4th spot in the power rankings, and also bumping up 1 spot from last week, just like Buffalo, is the Minnesota Wild. They had 4 games last week and did pretty good, getting 5 out of a possible 8 points. Started the week with a win over the Toronto Maple Leafs 6-3. Then they lost to the Montreal Canadiens in heartbreaking late game fashion 4-3, as Caulfield scored the winner with 15 seconds left like we mentioned, but then they took down the Red Wings 4-3 in overtime and lost to the Panthers 4-3 in overtime. So they had a couple of really impressive overtime games. One was a loss, one was a win. Could have gotten that Montreal game to overtime had they held on for 15 more seconds. So like they had a pretty decent week, getting 2 wins, getting 5 points. Like they didn't really gain much on their Central Division opponents, but still they had a really solid week, and because they had the winning record, I'm going to put them up to 4th spot in the power rankings. Still one of the best teams in the Central, still one of the best teams in the entire NHL. So because of all of that, I am going to bump them up to 4th spot in the power rankings. So offensively, teams looking pretty good with Kaprizov, with Eriksson Ek, with Boldy, who's now back. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Hughes and Faber, and in net, Wallstedt and Gustafsson have both been pretty good for the Minnesota Wild. So very interesting note there. Where the Wild go 2-1 last week, they're up to a 29-14-10 record, and that's why they are 4th in the power rankings. Now 3rd and 2nd spot in the power rankings are basically just flip-flopping from last week. So from 2nd spot in the power rankings last week down to 3rd spot this week is the Carolina Hurricanes. They didn't have a terrible week last week. They actually had a pretty decent one. They went 2-0-1. They started the week with a win like we talked about over the Buffalo Sabres. They had a short loss to the Chicago Blackhawks, but ended the week with a very good victory over the Ottawa Senators. So they are still one of the best teams in the entire NHL, the Metro Division leaders. Like 5 out of possible 6 points isn't too bad. So once again, just because of a couple of other teams still being better than them, I do bump them down to 3rd spot in the power rankings. But once again, it's nothing against them. They're having a pretty dang good season right now. They're up to a 32-15-5 record, and they're looking pretty good. So that's why they're 3rd spot in the power rankings. Offensively, teams looking pretty good with Aho, Svechnikov, Jarvis. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Gostisbehere and Nikishin. And in net, Bussi continues to play phenomenally for the Carolina Hurricanes. So all really solid stuff there from the Hurricanes as they get the 3rd spot in the power rankings. The 2nd spot in the power power rankings this week is the Colorado Avalanche, flip-flopping with the Hurricanes. So last week they were third in the power rankings. They improved to second in the power rankings. Didn't have a great week, but like the Minnesota Wild got 5 all possible 8 points. Started the week with a very impressive bounce-back game, taking down the Washington Capitals 5-2. Then in what was a goalie duel, they wound up losing 2-1 in a shootout that we talked about to the Anaheim Ducks. They followed that up with a bad 7-3 loss to the Philadelphia Flyers before they finished the week with a 4-1 impressive victory over the Toronto Maple Leafs. So once again, not the dominant Colorado we're used to seeing from earlier in the year, but they still had a pretty decent record going 2-1-1. They're still the best team points-wise in the entire NHL. So getting 5 possible 8 points are going to put them at the second spot in the power rankings, and they're still a pretty gosh dang good team. Looking at McKinnon and Chushkin all doing pretty good offensively. Defensively, McCarr, Tays doing pretty good. And in net, Scott Wedgwood, Mackenzie Blackwood, both been pretty good for the Colorado Avalanche. Showing all really solid stuff there from the Avs, as they are the second team in the power rankings. And the first team in the power rankings is the same first team in the power rankings as last week. Didn't show me anything to bump them out of the first spot. That's Tampa Bay Lightning. The Lightning had a really solid week last week. They went 2-1-0. They started the week with a very impressive win over the San Jose Sharks, 4-1, to extend their win streak. Then they got another win to extend their win streak by taking down the Chicago Blackhawks to win in a shootout, which was very impressive. Now, they did end the week on a sour note by having a complete defensive collapse, as we talked about way back in the video. They lost 8-5 to the Blue Jackets, which did end their point and win streak, which isn't overly good, but still, like, they had 4 out possible 6 points, 2 out possible 3 wins. If they had a little bit better defensively, they probably still are on a point streak. So all in all, both are still really good. They're climbing the standings fast. They're still second in the Atlantic Division, but they're probably still the hottest team in the entire NHL. And besides the Blue Jackets being their kryptonite, they are still a pretty gosh dang good team. So very interesting out there, but the Bolts are going to stay at the first spot in the power rankings after another very solid week. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with Kucherov, with Gensel, with Hagel. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Radish and Moser. And in net, Vasilevsky has been great for the Tampa Bay Lightning. So very interesting out there. But the Tampa Bay Lightning are doing great. They're a very well-rounded team. They're having another really good regular season, and because of that, I'm putting them as the first team in the power rankings yet again. So very interesting out there. But that's all I'm talking about in this video. I left you guys thoughts. Just to recap, teams who I took out of the power rankings from last week and teams who I put in. The Anaheim Ducks, who were not ranked at all last week, I put into the power rankings this week at the 9th spot in the power rankings, while the Golden Knights, who were 8th spot in the power rankings last week, had a really sour week, and I took down to the honorable mention. Those were the only 2 swaps I made from the power rankings last week. But just to recap, here are my power rankings for week 16. So the 10th spot you have Montreal, the 9th spot is Anaheim, the 8th spot is Dallas, the 7th spot is Utah, the 6th spot is Detroit, the 5th spot is Buffalo, the 4th spot is Minnesota, the 3rd spot is Carolina, the 2nd spot is Colorado, and number 1 again is the Tampa Bay Lightning. Definitely. I'll let you guys thoughts on all this down in the comment section below. Do you agree with me of where the placements are? Do you disagree with me? And if you disagree with me, who would you have in the power rankings as it sits right now? Definitely your thoughts on all of that down in the comment section below. That's all I'm going to talk for today. Remember to like this video, and if you're like to, remember to subscribe below. Thank you for all of your support. I would never be able to do this without all of you guys. So if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe button down below. Don't forget to leave a comment. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers. Don't forget to stay tuned for videos coming out in the very near future. Also a blog, news, rumors, analysis, stuff like that. So remember to check that out. I'll link to that down in the description below. Come and see you guys all for the next video. See you guys soon.